At 11:32 on the morning of December 20th, 1943, Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown gripped the controls of his B-17 bomber over Bremen, Germany, watching 250 flak guns open fire on his formation. 21 years old, 0 combat missions completed. This was his first. The German anti-aircraft gunners below were not ordinary soldiers. They were officer candidate school trainees, elite, the best marksmen the Luftwaffe had. And they had been waiting for the American bombers all morning. Brown's aircraft was called Ye Old Pub. It carried 10 men and 6,000 pounds of bombs. The target was a Focke-Wulf 190 fighter aircraft factory on the outskirts of Bremen. Intelligence officers had warned the crews at the morning briefing that they would face hundreds of German fighters. What they did not mention was that the position assigned to Brown's bomber was the most dangerous slot in the entire formation. The men of the 379th Bombardment Group had a name for it: Purple Heart Corner. The edge of the formation, the spot where German fighters always attacked first because the defensive fire from neighboring bombers could not overlap effectively. New crews were often assigned there. Brown's crew was the newest of all. Before Ye Old Pub could release its bombs, a 20mm cannon shell exploded directly in front of the cockpit. The plexiglass nose shattered. Temperatures at 27,000 feet were 60 degrees below zero. The wind now howled through the aircraft at over 150 miles per hour. The number 2 engine died instantly. The number 4 engine began overspeeding, forcing Brown to throttle it back to prevent catastrophic failure. The bomber slowed. The formation pulled ahead. Within seconds, Ye Olde Pub was alone. German fighters saw it immediately. 12 to 15 Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s descended on the crippled bomber like wolves on wounded prey. In the next 10 minutes, Ye Olde Pub would be torn apart by cannon fire. 9 of the 10 men aboard would be wounded or killed. The bomber would fall from 27,000 feet in an uncontrolled dive. And then, a German fighter pilot named Franz Stigler would face the most important decision of his life. This is the story of how one enemy became 9 brothers. How a German ace gave up his Knight's Cross to save an American crew. How 2 pilots met as enemies and became family for the rest of their lives. And how an act of mercy in 1943 created a legacy that would echo for 80 years. Charles Larry Brown was born October 24, 1922, in Weston, West Virginia. Small town, coal mining country. His father worked for the railroad. His mother raised Charlie and his 4 siblings. The family had nothing extra. The Depression hit West Virginia hard. But they had enough. Food on the table, clothes that fit, a roof that didn't leak. Charlie grew up watching airplanes. Weston had a small airfield. Biplanes would buzz over the town on weekends. Charlie would stand in his yard and watch them, imagining what it would be like to fly. He graduated high school in 1940. The war in Europe was escalating. Charlie knew it was coming for America. He enlisted in the Army Air Corps in 1941, before Pearl Harbor. They sent him to flight school, primary training in Alabama, basic in Texas, advanced training in Arizona. He earned his wings in 1943, second lieutenant, bomber pilot. The Army assigned him to B-17S, 4-engine heavy bombers, flying fortresses, the backbone of the American strategic bombing campaign over Europe. Brown trained with his crew at Kimballton, England, with the 379th Bombardment Group. His co-pilot was Spencer Pinky Luke. His bombardier was Al Sadok. His navigator was Bill Blackford. The gunners were Richard Peachout, Hugh Ecke Eckenrode, Alex Yelisanko, Sam Blackford, Lloyd Jennings, and Walter Hunsinger. 10 men. Average age, 22. None had flown a combat mission. December 20th, 1943 was supposed to be a milk run. That's what the intelligence officer said during the morning briefing. Target, Bremen. Expected opposition, moderate. The intelligence officer was either lying or mistaken. Bremen was one of the most heavily defended cities in Germany. The Focke-Wulf factory was critical to German aircraft production. The Luftwaffe had positioned over 300 fighters to intercept any American raid. Brown's crew took off at 09:30. They joined the formation over England, climbed to altitude, crossed into German airspace at 10:45. The flak started before they reached Bremen, black bursts filling the sky. The bombers couldn't maneuver during the bomb run. They had to fly straight and level while the bombardiers lined up their targets. Ye Old Pub was in Purple Heart Corner, left edge of the formation, the position every crew dreaded. At 11:32, the 20mm shell hit. The explosion was instantaneous. The nose of the aircraft vaporized. The plexiglass shattered. Wind at 150 miles per hour screamed through the cockpit. Blood from the bombardier's station sprayed backward into Brown's face. The number 2 engine died. The propeller windmilled uselessly. The aircraft began losing speed and altitude. Brown fought the controls, tried to stay with the formation, but Ye Old Pub was falling behind. Within 30 seconds, they were alone. The German fighters had been waiting for exactly this, a damaged bomber. Separated from the formation, no defensive support from neighboring aircraft. The first Focke-Wulf came in from 6 o'clock high, classic attack angle. The waist gunners opened fire, so did the tail gunner. The German broke off, then came around for another pass. More fighters joined. They attacked from every angle simultaneously, high, low, level. The defensive gunners couldn't track them all. The number 3 engine took hits. It didn't die, but power dropped to 50%. The number 4 engine was already throttled back. Brown was flying on less than half power. The hydraulic system failed. The electrical system failed. The oxygen system ruptured. Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, the tail gunner, took a direct hit from a 20mm cannon shell. He died instantly. Most of the other crew members were wounded. Brown caught a bullet fragment in his right shoulder. Luke, the co-pilot, was hit in the leg. The extreme cold had frozen the oil in the defensive guns. Of the 11 machine guns mounted on the B-17, only 3 remained operational. Then, the oxygen ran out. At 27,000 feet, the human brain cannot function without supplemental oxygen. Brown felt his vision narrowing. His hands went numb on the controls. Beside him, Luke was already unconscious. Brown's last thought before everything went black was that his crew was about to die on their very first mission. The Old Pub began to fall. The bomber dropped from 27,000 feet in an uncontrolled dive. The airspeed climbed past 300 miles per hour. The airframe shook violently. At any moment, the wings could tear off from the stress. But then, something happened that defied all logic. At approximately 1,000 feet above the ground, Brown regained consciousness. The thicker air at low altitude had enough oxygen to revive him. He grabbed the controls and pulled back with every ounce of strength he had left. The B-17 leveled out just above the treetops of northern Germany. Brown looked around the cockpit. Blood everywhere. Wounded men everywhere. His tail gunner was dead. His bomber was destroyed. And he had just flown directly over a German fighter airfield. On that airfield, a Luftwaffe pilot named Franz Stigler was refueling his Messerschmitt Bf-109. He had already shot down 2 American bombers that morning. One more kill would earn him the Knight's Cross, one of Germany's highest military honors. He looked up and saw Ye Old Pub limping across the sky at barely 100 feet. Franz Stigler climbed into his fighter. The engine roared to life. Within minutes, he was airborne and closing fast on the crippled American bomber. Franz Stigler was 28 years old. He had flown 487 combat missions. He had been shot down 17 times. He had bailed out of burning aircraft 6 times and crash-landed damaged planes 11 more. His brother August, also a pilot, had died in 1940 when his Junkers Ju-88 crashed during a night bombing mission over England. The war had taken everything from Stigler except his skill and his code. Before the war, Stigler had been a commercial pilot for Lufthansa. He had flown passengers across Europe in peace. He had never imagined he would spend years killing men he had never met. But Germany had called, and Stigler had answered. By December 1943, he was one of the most experienced fighter pilots in Jagdgeschwader 27. Now, he was closing on the tail of a crippled American bomber with 27 confirmed victories to his name. One more heavy bomber would complete the requirement for the Knight's Cross. The medal would honor not just him, but his dead brother. It would prove that the Stigler family had given everything to Germany. His Messerschmitt Bf 109G6 was not in perfect condition. Earlier that morning, during his attack on the first 2 bombers, an American .50 caliber bullet had lodged in his radiator. The engine was at risk of overheating, but Stigler had taken off anyway. The crippled B-17 was too easy a target to ignore. He approached from behind and below, the classic attack angle. His finger found the trigger. His gun sight settled on the tail section of the American bomber. And then, Franz Stigler saw something that made him lift his finger away from the trigger. The tail gunner's compartment was destroyed. Through the massive holes in the fuselage, Stigler could see the body of a young American slumped over his machine gun. Blood had frozen in long red icicles from the shattered turret. The man was clearly dead. Stigler pulled his fighter alongside the bomber and looked through more holes in the aircraft skin. He saw wounded men trying to help other wounded men. He saw a crewman with blood covering his face. He saw another whose leg had been torn open by shrapnel. He saw the pilot and co-pilot struggling to keep the aircraft in the air. None of them were fighting. None of them could fight. They were just trying to survive. In that moment, Franz Stigler remembered the words of a man named Gustav Rödel. Rödel had been Stigler's commanding officer in North Africa, where Stigler had flown with Jagdgeschwader 27 against the British in the Libyan desert. Rödel was a different kind of German officer. He believed that war had rules. He believed that a fighter pilot's honor came not from how many enemies he killed, but from how he killed them. Rödel had once gathered his pilots and told them something that Stigler never forgot. You are fighter pilots first, last, always. If I ever hear of any of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. The meaning was clear. A man in a parachute was defenseless. He could not fight back. Killing him was not combat. It was murder. And murder had no place in the code of a true fighter pilot. Stigler looked again at the shattered bomber beside him. The Americans were not hanging from parachutes, but they might as well have been. They had no working guns. They had no speed. They had no way to defend themselves. Shooting them down would not be a victory. It would be an execution. Stigler felt the weight of the rosary beads in his flight jacket pocket. His mother had wanted him to become a priest. He had chosen flying instead. But her faith had stayed with him. He thought of his brother August, dead over England. Would August want him to murder defenseless men for a medal? Stigler made his decision. He would not shoot, but he would not leave them either. He positioned his Messerschmitt on the B-17's wing, close enough that Charlie Brown could see him clearly through the cockpit window. Inside Ye Old Pub, the crew saw the German fighter and assumed they were about to die. Brown saw the pilot looking at him. The German raised his hand, not pointing, not threatening, just acknowledging. Then Stigler began to fly formation with the crippled bomber. He stayed on their wing as they crossed the German coast. He knew that German coastal flak batteries would fire on any aircraft flying that low, but they wouldn't fire if they saw a Luftwaffe fighter escorting the bomber. They would assume the bomber was a German aircraft in distress, or a captured Allied bomber being brought in for study. Stigler was using his presence to protect them. For 5 minutes, he flew alongside. When they crossed the coast and headed over the North Sea toward England, Stigler pulled close one final time. He saluted Charlie Brown, a military salute, pilot to pilot. Then he peeled away and headed back toward Germany. Brown watched him go. He had no idea what had just happened, why a German fighter pilot had chosen to escort them instead of shooting them down. He just knew they were still alive. Ye Old Pub limped across the North Sea on 2 failing engines. They couldn't maintain altitude, they couldn't maintain course, but they stayed in the air. Brown made it to England. He found an RAF base on the coast, put the bomber down. The landing was rough, but they survived it. Emergency crews swarmed the aircraft. Medics pulled out the wounded, covered Eckenrode's body. The British who examined Ye Old Pub counted over 400 bullet and shrapnel holes. The tail was nearly severed. The nose was destroyed. 1 engine was dead, 2 more barely functioning. A RAF officer told Brown the aircraft would never fly again. It was scrap metal. Brown didn't care about the aircraft. His crew had survived, 9 of them. That was all that mattered. Debriefing came 2 days later at Kimballton. Brown told the intelligence officers everything: the attack, the dive, the German fighter that escorted them over the coast instead of shooting them down. The intelligence officer told him never to repeat that story. Ever. If word got out that a German pilot had shown mercy, it could be seen as enemy propaganda. It could undermine morale. It could make other crews hesitate in combat. The official report would state that Ye Old Pub had fought its way back to England alone. No mention of the German pilot. Brown agreed. He told his crew the same thing. They were ordered never to speak of it. For 46 years, Charlie Brown kept that promise. Brown flew 28 more combat missions over Europe. He survived them all. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. He came home in 1945, married his girlfriend, started a career. But he never forgot the German pilot who had saved his life. He didn't know the pilot's name, didn't know what unit he'd flown with, didn't know if he'd survived the war. But he remembered the salute. Pilot to pilot. In 1989, Brown decided to break his silence. 46 years had passed. The war was long over. The men who'd ordered him to stay quiet were dead. Brown contacted military historians. He told them the story, asked if they could help him find the German pilot. Most didn't believe him. The story was too extraordinary. A German ace giving up a kill to escort a crippled bomber? It didn't fit the narrative of how the war was remembered, but one historian took him seriously. He suggested Brown contact the Luftwaffe Veterans Association in Germany. Brown wrote a letter. He described what happened on December 20th, 1943. Described the German fighter, asked if anyone remembered such a mission. He sent it to Germany and waited. 4 months later, he received a reply. Franz Stigler was living in Vancouver, British Columbia. He had emigrated to Canada after the war, become a businessman, raised a family. And yes, he remembered December 20th, 1943. He remembered the crippled B-17. He remembered the salute. He had kept silent about it for 46 years too, for different reasons. In post-war Germany, admitting you'd let an enemy bomber escape could be seen as treason, as weakness. Stigler had told no one. Brown called him in January 1990. The phone rang in Vancouver. Franz Stigler answered. "Is this the pilot who saved a B-17 on December 20th, 1943? Brown asked. There was silence on the line. Then Stigler spoke, his German accent still heavy after 45 years in Canada. "Are you the pilot of that B-17? They talked for 4 hours that first call. Both men wept. They had spent 46 years wondering if the other was still alive, wondering if the memory was real or imagined. Now, they had their answer. Brown flew to Vancouver in March 1990. He met Franz Stigler face to face for the first time since the war. The two men embraced like brothers. They spent the next week together, talking, sharing stories, filling in the gaps of 46 years. Stigler explained why he hadn't shot. The code of honor, Rudel's words, his brother's death, the rosary beads. Brown explained what had happened to his crew, how they'd survived, how most had gone on to live full lives, how Eckenrode had died, but the other 9 had made it home. Before Brown left Vancouver, Stigler said something that would define the rest of their relationship. "Charlie, I lost my brother in 1940. On December 20th, 1943, I was given the chance to save 9 Americans from destruction. You became as precious to me as my brother was." He paused. "You are my brother now." Brown and Stigler remained close for the next 18 years. They called each other every week. They visited each other multiple times a year. They traveled together to speak at schools, military bases, and historical societies. They told their story hundreds of times, to veterans, to students, to anyone who would listen. The message was always the same. Even in war, humanity matters. Even when nations demand hatred, individuals can choose mercy. In 2008, the surviving crew members of Ye Olde Pub were awarded the Air Force Cross, the second highest decoration the United States Air Force can give. It was unprecedented. No other World War II bomber crew had been collectively honored this way. The ceremony was held with great solemnity. Surviving crew members attended with their families. The families of the dead came to accept medals on behalf of fathers and grandfathers they'd lost. Brown was there, 85 years old, his body frail, but his spirit unbroken. And standing beside him, as he had stood for nearly 2 decades, was Franz Stigler. Franz Stigler died on March 22, 2008. He was 92 years old. Charlie Brown received the news in Florida. The man who had become his brother was gone. Brown was devastated, but he was also at peace. He knew that Stigler had died knowing the truth. The B-17 had made it home. The crew had survived. The decision he made over Germany in 1943 had mattered. 8 months later, on November 24, 2008, Charlie Brown died in Miami. He was 87 years old. The two men who had met as enemies over the skies of Germany, who had become brothers across the divide of war, who had spent the last years of their lives telling their story to the world, were finally reunited. They had died the same year, just 8 months apart, as if one could not bear to live too long without the other. The legacy they left behind continues to grow. In 2012, author Adam Makos published a book about their story. He called it A Higher Call. The title came from Stigler's own words about why he had spared the American bomber. The book became a New York Times bestseller. Readers were captivated by the story of two enemies who became brothers. In 2014, a Swedish heavy metal band called Sabaton released a song about the incident. They called it No Bullets Fly. The song reached audiences who had never heard of Brown or Stigler. Young people around the world learned about the German pilot who had refused to kill and the American pilot who had spent 46 years searching for him. In 2019, a surviving B-17 bomber operated by the Erickson Aircraft Collection in Oregon was repainted in the colors and markings of Ye Olde Pub. The restored aircraft flies at air shows across the United States, keeping the memory of the original crew alive for new generations. But perhaps the most powerful legacy is the simplest one: the families. Hugh Eckenrode, the tail gunner who died over Bremen, had a grandniece who never forgot him. She tracked down a lithograph of Ye Olde Pub and Stigler's Messerschmitt and gave it to her father. For decades, the family had wondered what had happened to their uncle. Brown and Stigler's story finally gave them answers. The descendants of the surviving crew members number in the dozens: children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, teachers, doctors, soldiers, artists. Every single one of them owes their existence to a German pilot who chose not to pull the trigger. At the reunions, when Stigler met these families, he was always overwhelmed. He had never expected to see the consequences of his choice laid out so clearly. A wall of faces, a crowd of lives, all because he had remembered the words of Gustav Rödel, all because he had refused to shoot men who could not fight back. Stigler once wrote a note to Brown that captured everything he felt. He explained that he had lost his only brother in 1940. He wrote that on December 20th, 1943, he had been given the chance to save a B-17 from destruction. He wrote that Charlie Brown had become as precious to him as his brother had been. He signed the note with 2 words, "Your brother, Franz." The story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler is not a story about war. It is a story about what survives when war is over. It is a story about honor that transcends nationality. It is a story about mercy that echoes across generations. 2 young men met in the sky over Germany in 1943. One had every reason to kill, the other had no way to survive. And in that moment, something happened that neither man could explain, something that defied orders, defied hatred, defied everything the war demanded of them. Franz Stigler answered a higher call, and Charlie Brown spent the rest of his life grateful that he did. The Knight's Cross that Stigler gave up to save those 9 Americans, he never received it, never got that 28th kill. But he received something far more valuable. He received a brother, a family, a legacy that will outlive him by generations. That's worth more than any medal.